There is a German scientist, his name is Konstantin Weil, and he demonstrated that the human DNA is like a receptor. It has the ability to transmit information using scalar waves across the entire universe. Because for those who know what scalar waves are, it goes through physical object. There's nothing can stop scalar waves. So when you have a thought, it has the potential to traverse the entire universe and back.
Wow.
Is that insane or what? Faster than the speed of light, because it's not going through the normal linear waves. When you think about that potential, it's so much more exciting of all the things that you can do. This means that you can bring information from any part of the universe instantaneously, translate it into your human brain, and create what you want. That's, to me, the ultimate future human.
All right, diving in today, folks, getting ready to explore something pretty wild, cell communication, but not in the way we usually think about it. You know, putting aside the usual suspects like hormones and all those chemical signals.
Yeah, we're going way deeper.
Exactly. The listener sent over some seriously cool research. It's all about how physics, specifically this idea of magnetic scalar waves, might play a key role in how cells talk to each other.
And get this, it also brings those often overlooked parts of our DNA into the spotlight introns. You know, what we used to think of as junk DNA.
Right. Jump DNA. Not so fast, it seems.
Nope. We're going to be diving into two articles, both by Konstantin Weil, Task of the Introns, Cell Communication Explained by Field Physics, and DNA and Cell Resonance. Magnetic waves enable cell communication. We're on a mission here to really get our heads around this potentially brand new way of looking at cell communication.
Totally. What is this proposed mechanism all about? What's the role of introns in all of this? And what kind of evidence are we actually working with here? This stuff could honestly change the way we understand what's happening inside us.
It has the potential.
Okay, so let's break it down. Usually when we think about cells communicating, we think about hormones traveling through the bloodstream, right? Neurotransmitters zipping across synapses, chemical signals galore.
Yeah, the usual picture.
But these articles, they're proposing something completely different. Alongside all that chemistry, they say there could be this other form of communication happening, something almost instantaneous using waves.
And this is where it gets interesting. The traditional view focuses on these molecular signals, all that chemistry. But Mail's work suggests that DNA itself, the molecule of life, might actually be acting like a tiny antenna.
An antenna, like sending and receiving signals?
Sending and receiving information, yeah, but encoded in waves, not chemicals. Specifically, he's talking about a longitudinal wave that propagates along the magnetic field of the DNA molecule itself.
The DNA wave. That sounds like, honestly, it sounds straight out of science fiction. How can DNA generate a wave? DNA is just a molecule, right?
Well, think about the structure of DNA, that iconic double helix. The base pairs, adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, they're all electrically charged and held together by hydrogen bonds.
Okay, I remember that from biology class.
So to access the genetic information stored in DNA, those bonds have to be temporarily broken, loosened up a bit. And when that happens, it creates this swirling vortex field of electrical energy.
So you've got this electrical energy, a vortex swirling around the DNA. Okay, I'm following.
Now add to that the fact that DNA also has a magnetic field, and this field runs perpendicular to the electric field. So this moving vortex of electrical energy interacting with the magnetic field, it creates a wave that travels along the DNA's magnetic axis. Imagine pushing a slinky, creating a compression wave that travels along its length. This magnetic scalar wave is similar.
So it's like a ripple, but this ripple is traveling at super speed along DNA's magnetic field, right? And I remember reading something about the speed that it's almost unbelievable how fast this wave could be moving.
You're right. The calculations put this DNA wave traveling at something like 140,000 kilometers per second.
Wow.
For perspective, that's a huge chunk of the speed of light. The articles even include a diagram, figure 1, showing exactly how those electric and magnetic fields are arranged within the DNA double helix.
So we've got DNA potentially broadcasting information as these super fast magnetic scalar waves. Now let's bring those introns into the story. For years, these non-coding bits of DNA, they were called junk. But these sources, they propose something much more interesting for introns, a crucial role in this whole wave-based communication system.
Absolutely. The argument here is that introns might be vital for cells to achieve and maintain this state of resonance when they're trying to exchange genetic information.
Resonance? Like, I'm thinking about musical instruments. Like
Yeah.
when you pluck a guitar string, and then another string tuned to the exact same frequency starts vibrating even though you didn't touch it.
You got it. That's a great analogy. For this wave-based communication to work, for the message to get through the transmitting cell and the receiving cell, they need to be perfectly tuned to each other. And that requires a match in frequency, an opposite alignment or phase, and a similar wave pattern, just like those guitar strings.
Makes sense.
Now imagine two cells are trying to share some genetic information. The actual coding regions, the exons, they might have different sequences, right? They're carrying different information.
Sure, that's kind of the whole point of genetic diversity.
Exactly. But those differences, they could mess up the resonance. They could prevent those cells from achieving that perfect tuning, that connection they need to communicate effectively.
Oh, interesting. So the very information they're trying to share could block the connection.
That's the paradox. And that's where those introns come in. Remember, introns don't code for proteins. They're non-coding. And the sources suggest they could act as these neutral resonators. Basically, they provide identical, non-information carrying sections that can form standing waves between two cells.
Standing waves. Okay, remind me what those are again.
A standing wave, it's like a wave that's trapped between 2 points. It's oscillating, but it doesn't seem to be moving, like the wave on a vibrating guitar string.
Got it. Okay.
So these introns, they help create these standing waves between cells, establishing a sort of common ground for resonance. It's like a shared rhythm that allows for that clear communication, even if the active information, the exons, were different.
Wow, so these introns, these sections of DNA we thought were useless, they might actually be essential for cells to understand each other. It's mind-blowing. And like the article mentions, this could have implications for evolution itself, right? If cells couldn't achieve this resonance, if they couldn't exchange genetic information effectively, how could life adapt and change over time?
It's a big question. The argument is that without these introns acting as neutral resonators, the transfer of energy and information between cells, it just wouldn't be precise or efficient enough. It really makes you reconsider what we call junk DNA. It could be one of evolution's most important innovations.
Totally reframes our thinking for sure. Okay, so we've got this wave traveling down the DNA, introns helping cells connect and resonate. But what's the energy source? What's actually driving this DNA wave?
Here, the sources point to the unique ring structures you find in the DNA bases: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. These bases have what are called pyrimidine rings, which are similar to benzene rings, those 6 carbon rings you might remember from chemistry.
Vaguely.
Well, these rings have electrons that aren't bound to specific atoms. They can move freely within the ring structure, what we call delocalized electrons.
So are you saying these tiny little rings are like little energy hubs within the DNA molecule?
That's the idea. The movement of these delocalized electrons, it creates a tiny magnetic field. And if this movement oscillates, vibrates at a certain frequency, it generates an alternating magnetic field, which in turn can produce the magnetic scalar wave we've been talking about.
Okay, so the vibration of those electrons in the ring structures is the engine powering this whole DNA wave system. Pretty cool.
And it gets even cooler when you think about the orientation of these rings. They're positioned perpendicular to the long axis of the DNA molecule, which means their magnetic fields are perfectly aligned to drive that wave along the DNA strand. The articles include Figure 4, which illustrates these benzene and pyrimidine ring structures and their orientation.
It all fits together. So we've got this proposed mechanism for wave generation, introns acting like tuning forks to help establish connection, and these little vibrating rings as the energy source. Does any of this connect with what we already know about biology? Is there anything we've observed that supports this idea?
That's where things get really exciting because there are some compelling connections. The calculated frequency of this DNA wave, it's about 10 to the power of 15 hertz.
Okay, I'm not great with scientific notation. How fast is that?
That puts it in the ultraviolet UV range of the electromagnetic spectrum.
UV light. Interesting.
Hold on, it gets better. This frequency actually lines up remarkably well with the work of Professor Pop on biophotons. He discovered that living cells emit ultra-weak light, and guess what? This light falls right in the UV range. These articles suggest that this might not be a coincidence. These biophotons, they might be a direct manifestation of these DNA waves.
So we're saying that the predicted frequency of the DNA wave matches the frequency of light that cells actually give off? That's a pretty big deal.
It's a strong link. And there's more. Professor Heine's research on the extracellular matrix, that scaffolding around cells, he found tunnel-like structures with dimensions that correspond to the calculated wavelength of this DNA wave. Theoretical calculations matching physical observations again. The articles even point out that the path these base rings take along the helix is a bit longer than the direct length of the DNA strand, about 2.14 times longer, which shifts the expected light absorption spectrum of DNA into the 260-280 nanometer range.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following the math there.
It's just that the longer path changes how the light interacts with the DNA. And guess what? That range, 260-280 nanometers, it perfectly matches the experimentally measured UV absorption peak of DNA, which is at 260 nanometers.
So multiple lines of evidence all pointing to the same conclusion.
Exactly. And that conclusion is that wave-based communication might be a fundamental part of how biology works. It's really elegant how these seemingly separate discoveries are all starting to fit together.
It's like we're uncovering this hidden language of the cells. Okay, now zooming out a bit, thinking about the bigger picture. The sources mention how magnetic fields might interact with biological systems differently than electric fields. They even bring up MRI as an example.
Right, magnetic resonance imaging. It shows us that the body can actually tolerate pretty strong static magnetic fields without any major issues. So the idea here is that this cell communication via magnetic scalar waves, it might involve a kind of initial scatter field, what you might even call an aura, emanating from each cell.
An aura, like a mystical energy field.
They use the term aura to describe the initial outward projection of the field, which allows other cells to sense it and tune in to its frequency. It's like sending out a signal to find a compatible partner for communication.
Okay, I'm getting a bit of a new age vibe here.
Don't worry, they bring it back to science. The articles distinguish between what they call forced resonance and free resonance. Forced resonance has a limited range because it relies on that initial scatter field, that aura, to find other cells. Free resonance, on the other hand, is when two cells have established a direct connection, a closed loop, and that can theoretically operate over much larger distances, potentially even unlimited distances.
Unlimited. That's pretty wild. And this is where they get into those more speculative ideas like telepathy or telekinesis, right?
Right. They suggest that those phenomena might be related to this concept of free resonance. But it's important to remember that these are just potential implications, things to think about, not established scientific facts.
Okay, so keeping our feet on the ground while we're exploring these far-out possibilities. But the idea of a closed resonance circuit for efficient private communication between cells, that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Once resonance is established, the transfer of energy and information between those two cells, it becomes super efficient. There's minimal scattering, very little of that energy or signal leaking out where we could easily detect it. Everything is contained within that connected pair.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want your cell phone calls being broadcast for everyone to hear, right?
And this leads to a very interesting idea that the articles bring up. They propose that certain very strong interpersonal connections, like love, might be so difficult to measure, to quantify scientifically, precisely because the energy and information fields involved are so completely closed and contained within that bond.
Wow, that's a really beautiful way to think about it. All right, so let's bring it all together. We've gone deep into the world of cells and DNA today, and it's clear that these sources propose a fascinating alternative to our traditional understanding of cell communication. They suggest that DNA might actually use magnetic scalar waves to transmit information, and these waves are powered by the vibrations of those tiny ring structures within the DNA bases themselves.
And we can't forget about introns. Those so-called junk DNA segments, they might be crucial for establishing resonance, allowing cells to connect and communicate effectively.
Right. Introns are the unsung heroes of cell communication. And what's really compelling is how these theoretical ideas actually line up with some real-world observations, like the emission of biophotons from cells and DNA's unique light absorption properties.
That's all connected. And while this is still a debated area of research, it's a really compelling perspective on the fundamental ways our cells interact and exchange information.
It's truly mind-blowing to think about the complexity and elegance of what's happening inside us at the cellular level. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, and it makes you wonder if this model of resonant communication, this idea of cells talking to each other through magnetic scalar waves, if it's accurate, what could that mean for our understanding of health and well-being? Could we learn to harness these communication channels for therapy? Could we develop a whole new understanding of holistic health based on this idea of resonance? It's a pretty amazing frontier to consider.
Lots of potential for the future.
Well, thank you for joining me on this incredible journey into the world of cell communication. And a huge thank you to the listener who sent us these fascinating research articles. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the world of knowledge.
Until then.
See you then.
Did you get any of that?